If you want to learn how to machine bind a quilt, you have found the right place. Last time I made a video on this, there was some annoying music in the background, so I will make sure not to add anything this time. Let me show you how I bind a quilt from start to finish. I am going to use 2.5-inch strips to bind my quilt. If you are following my Learn to Quilt series and making the same size as me, you will need 5 of these. So this will be 5 2.5 by width of fabric strips. And if you're not sure what the width of your fabric is, you can find this by finding the 2 selvage ends, and from one to the other is the width of your fabric. Typically this is like 40 to 44 inches. And to make it easier to cut, I like to fold mine at least once or twice and cut it that way. First, I'm going to square up the end so that my fabric is cut straight, and then I will go ahead and cut my 2.5-inch strips. If you're making a different size, you'll want to follow your pattern directions, or if you're making the sawtooth star quilt in a different size, check out my blog for how much you need. Once you have these cut, you will need to attach them together to make one long strip. I like to use a diagonal seam to do this to reduce bulk in the binding for when it's on our quilt. So how I do this is I lay one strip horizontally and then I place another one vertically so they are perpendicular to each other. They should have 90-degree angles on all 4 corners here, and the fabrics are placed right sides together. Then I use a small ruler to mark a line diagonally from the top left to the bottom right. I like to use a hero marker here, but any fabric marker will do. And then I place a pin in it, and then I will sew right along this line. Then I just continue on doing this until all of my strips are put together. Then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and trim this back so there's just a 1/4-inch seam allowance. And then I usually press it open when I take it to my iron in our next step. Once all of your binding strips are joined together, you are going to want to fold your binding in half along the entire length of the binding with wrong sides facing together. So the right side of the fabric should be facing outward. And I just go ahead and take my iron and press along the length of my fabric until it is all pressed in half. If you have a long binding strip, sometimes it helps to roll it up a little bit, or there are really neat tools called binding spools that you can use to neatly roll it up. Once your binding is prepared, it's time to attach it to the quilt. Like many things in quilting, there are many ways to attach binding to the quilt, so I am just going to show you how I like to do it. And if this is your first time, you can try it my way. You can look up a few different ways and make your own decision. Or maybe you've been quilting for a while and you want to try my way because you haven't before. I actually start by attaching my binding to the front side of the quilt. I want to make sure I am not starting too close to the corner. I do about halfway down one of the sides of the quilt, and you will want the fold on the left or the inside of the quilt, and then the raw edges or where the fold opens on the right side matching up with the raw edge of your quilt. You're going to want to leave, I leave at least a foot of extra binding loose, so you don't want to start sewing right from the edge of where your binding starts. You see here I have this tail. I would say minimally you need 8 inches there. And then I begin attaching the binding by sewing a 1/4 inch away from the raw edges of the binding and the quilt. I like to use my walking foot here just because there's still a lot of layers of fabric and I find it goes on more evenly this way. And you can pin it or clip it ahead of time, or if you're like me, you can just line it up as you go. As you approach the edge here, we are going to make a mitered corner. So you're going to want to figure out where a 1/4 inch from the edge of your quilt is. If you don't quite have an eye for this yet, definitely just get out a ruler and measure it. Once you figure out where that is, you're going to want to mark it, or like if there's a pattern in the fabric, you can kind of remember where it is and then sew to that point. Once you get there, you're going to want to stop and make sure your needle is down, and then lift your foot, rotate your quilt 45 degrees, and then sew off of the edge here. I do a little back stitch here. I'm not really sure if that's the right or wrong way to do it, but I go 45 degrees off the edge of my quilt. I do a little bit back, and I'm so sorry this is blurry. I had no idea at the time, obviously. And then once you have sewn off there, you go ahead and cut the threads, and this is what that should look like. To make this corner, we're going to then fold it up at a 45-degree angle. So you should see from the corner of the quilt down to the folded part of your binding should be 45 degrees, and then fold it down at a 90-degree angle. I like to stick a ruler here to make it nice and clean when I pull it back down. And then we are going to sew this along the next edge of our quilt. Before sewing, you'll obviously want to pull that ruler out, and then you can clip this in place, or if you feel confident just holding it and bringing it back to your machine, that works too. Next, you'll just want to start sewing again and attach the next edge, and then repeat this process with the other 3 corners of your quilt. Once you get back onto the edge of the quilt that you started on, you are going to want to make note of where you started your binding and make sure that you stop your binding about, 8 to 12 inches before you reach that starting point again. We are going to want to leave this space open and connect our binding strip. So once you get about, 10 inches away from that starting point, go ahead and remove your quilt from the machine. You see here, there's this gap in between where I start and stop my binding. You can make it even larger. I like to go a little larger just because this way I have more room to work with. Now we're going to connect these 2 binding strips with a diagonal seam. I do this by taking both ends and then folding them back on themselves and making sure I press them down really well so that I'm able to see those folds when I open them up. You will see that I left about 1/8 to 1/4 inch in between the 2 folds. Then go ahead and open up bottom strip and have the right side of the fabric facing downward. Then I place a pin right where the 2 folds meet. Next, open up the top strip and have the right side of the fabric facing upward. And you will want to put the pin right in the same spot where those 2 folds meet here. So now the right sides of both pieces of your binding strips are facing together. Now we're going to want to make sure these are perpendicular to each other. So whatever is happening with your quilt on the left is totally fine. You can bunch it up as much as you want. And what I'm doing is making like an X shape with the 2 binding strips. You'll want to make sure that they can lay nice and flat on each other and that the fabric is facing right sides together. And then the folds should actually line up. The horizontal fold should line up with the vertical fold on one piece and then vice versa with the others. And then I want to pin it in place so that it does not shift at all. Next, you will want to mark a line that will go diagonally through. So it goes from kind of like the top corner here down to the bottom corner. And again, I'm just using my hero marker. And then what you're going to do is sew right along this line. Once you have sewn there, this is what it should look like. And I always open it up before trimming it back. So go ahead and open up your quilt, lay it flat, and make sure that the binding is lining up how you would like it to. You'll want to make sure it's nice and flat and that your quilt is also nice and flat and that they are the same length. And then once it looks good, go ahead and trim this back. Make sure you're trimming on the right side of the stitches and getting rid of the excess binding and not trimming on the other side. Next, all you need to do is stitch this down. You can press the seam open if you'd like, and then stitch it down like you did the rest of the binding on your quilt. Now is the time where we have to attach the binding to the other side of the quilt. This is where things differ greatly amongst quilters. You can even hand stitch it on. I like to use my machine for the entire process, though hand stitching can sometimes look a little nicer. I'm just going to show you how I like to do it. First, I start by giving my binding a little press upward, just making it easier to work with and making sure that it's fully opened. What we are going to do then is flip the quilt over and then start pinning down or clipping down the binding to make sure it covers up the previously sewn stitch lines from when I attach it to the front of the quilt. So I just go along the entire perimeter of the quilt and clip this down. I actually love glue basting instead of using clips all the way. So if you're interested in that, check out some of my other videos. And this is what a corner will look like. You'll go ahead and pull it all the way and there should be like a 45-degree angle hanging off of the end. And then you pull the other side over that and kind of mess around with it until it looks how you'd like. And that's how you will finish your mitered corners. So go ahead and do this along all of the binding on your quilt. And once you have folded it all over, then we're going to want to attach it and we will be done. I like to actually stitch it down from the front. And how I do this is I stitch either in the ditch or slightly onto the actual binding to make sure I'm catching the back. And I just go around the entire perimeter of the quilt, and it should be catching it in the back since we made sure it was covering up that stitch line when we folded it over. If you're not confident that you're going to be catching it, you could also stitch from the back. I have just found that this way works best for me, and this is how my quilts turn out the best when I'm machine binding them. And then I tumble dry it on low heat. And that is how I make a quilt. I hope you enjoyed this series and save this one for later, because if you're new to quilting and if you're anything like me, you will need to watch a video on machine binding a quilt for like at least your first 10 quilts.